Programmed drums can sound so robotic. I've got a couple ways to help you fix that. Welcome back, home studio professionals. In this video, I want to share with you a few ways to make your robotic programmed drums sound so realistic that you won't be able to tell them apart from a real drummer. I will be covering some of the basics, of course, but I've got some secret weapons for you that will really liven things up. Now, I'm using Pro Tools, but this stuff will work in any software. Let's get to the computer to get started. Alright, so if we take a look in Pro Tools here, I've got a few examples queued up, but before we start this, I want to explain velocity. For those of you who don't know, if you zoom in to your MIDI notes, I've got a snare here, and there's this little flag, this little dot on a pole, and each MIDI note has its own flag. That flag represents velocity, or how hard a drummer is going to be hitting. Now, if I click on this MIDI note, it highlights the flag. If I click and drag, it's going to increase it, and you're going to hear the intensity ramp up. So that's with the velocity cranked. If I turn it down, it's a lot softer. Now, defaults to about 3/4 of the way up, and if we want to program a snare roll, like what a lot of drummers do in their fills, if we just leave it at the default velocity, it's going to sound like this. That just sounds dumb. It doesn't sound like a snare roll. It just sounds like a fake snare that has no dynamics to it. So over here, I've got an example of a snare roll that's a lot more realistic. Let me just play it for you, and then I'll walk you through how I did this. And it took me just a few seconds. That sounds a lot more realistic than this. Now, this realistic one, as you can see, I raised up here. Let me just drag this up so you can see exactly what's going on here. There, now you get a better picture of the velocity curves. So this first note is the default. When drummers do snare rolls, they typically do left, right, and most drummers are right-handed. So they're going to hit less hard with their left hand. That's their non-dominant hand. So I turned down this one, and then I turned up the third one, which would be back to the right hand, up just a little bit from that, and then back down on the left hand, and then to emphasize the downbeat, I bring it back up to the default, and then I just follow that same pattern until it starts ramping up towards the end. So I'll just go through these and click on them so you can hear and see the velocity curves down here. So here's the full curve, and it's going to give you a much more realistic drum pattern. But those velocities aren't just helpful for snares, they're also really helpful for any drums really, but especially on kicks. Now, when a drummer is playing, they're typically going to emphasize the downbeat, the one of every bar. So what I've done here is I've increased this kick velocity on the downbeats just a little bit compared to the ones on beat number 3. So let's just play it, and then I'll walk you through it. It's subtle, but you can make it more extreme. See, it sounds more dynamic already, and it makes a big difference just with those little moves. But if you want to get a little crazier with this beat 3, where there's 2 kicks in a row, a drummer typically hits their first kick a little harder and their second one a little softer. So you could have your downbeat nice and high, and then your first 8th note in between them, and then the 3rd note on the default. And then I'm going to increase this one quick, and then I'll just loop this section so you can hear the dynamics. And of course, you can do the same thing with cymbals and get even more dynamics built into your drum kit. Up next is something that I don't see often enough with programmed drums, and when people send me programmed drums, I often end up doing this on my own just to make the mix better, but I like to offset the timing of some of the drums to make it sound wider and more realistic, because a real drummer is not going to be able to hit a snare, a floor tom, and a kick drum all at the same time. And even if they do, a lot of times I'll end up moving them slightly just to offset them a little bit, and I'll show you why. So if we zoom in here, we see that this first loop is all perfectly on the grid lines. And I already have the dynamics pre-programmed in. So the dynamics on each of these takes is going to be the exact same. I just took it and duplicated it. But if we listen to this while they're all perfectly on time, it'll sound fine with the dynamics. But when you hear the difference between this one and the second one, you'll hear what I'm talking about. Sounds fine, right? But if we play this one, we get this. It can be kind of subtle at first, but you really start to hear the separation in each of the drums. I could clearly hear that there was a kick drum, a floor tom, and a snare drum being played because I offset them just a little bit. Now I went through each one, and they all have to be a little bit different. You can't just kind of set one the way you want it and then copy and paste them all. It doesn't really sound natural that way, but I like to have the snare right on top of the beat all the time. The snare is a lot of high end, and if that is off time, it sounds weird. So when I'm editing real drums, I always put that on the grid line, and then everything else kind of moves around it as it does naturally. So we got the snare right here, right on the grid, and a kick a little bit behind the grid, and then the floor tom pretty far behind the grid. Then we've got our second one, which is just the snare and floor tom. Again, the floor tom is a little bit behind. Then this one, I put the kick just a little bit ahead of the grid, snare right on the grid line, floor tom behind it, and so on and so forth. This one, I put the floor tom ahead of it, and there's no like scientific magic formula for this stuff. I just do what I've seen in a lot of sessions with editing drums, what a lot of drummers do, and I just copy that. So when you're programming your MIDI drums, it's really important to get the headspace of you're behind the kit. What is physically possible? Even if you can't play drums, let's say you had 20 years experience, you can play anything you want. How are you going to play it? What's realistic? Number 3 on my list is using real room samples. So I'm not talking about like a reverb plugin. I'm talking about using a sampler plugin like Slate Trigger to take a room sample and add it to your snare. So I'll play you these programmed drums I have. So it sounds fine, but it still sounds like programmed drums to me. And how I would fix something like this is I would open up the Sourcetrack Samples Noetic pack, and I would go into this Rooms folder. Now these are TCI samples. There are also wave samples within this pack as well. So if you are a psycho like me and don't actually like using MIDI to program drums, there's the wave files you can just drag into your session and have them blend in with each of your samples as well. But we've got all rooms, which is a blend of a hallway mic, a mono room, and 2 stereo rooms. We've also got individual folders for each of those as well. There's a ton of files in here. But there's room samples for kick, snares, flam snares, rim snares, 5 different toms. So you get different response from the room with different frequencies. So we're going to put this on the snare. We're just going to slap the all rooms TCI file on there. And let's just mess with this a bit and see what we get. That right there added a ton of width and energy, and it just made it sound a lot more organic. It still had power, it still had punch, but it doesn't have to be super dry and boring. All you need is just some real room samples. If you don't want this much, if this is a little bit too much, if you just want width, let's say, let's mute that sample, and let's get the snare stereo room, and let's just do this one. So I'll mute this, and I'll bring it back in. much more lively just with this stereo room sample, and it's going to help your snare cut through the mix a lot better too because it has that mid-range to beef it up. Before we get to number 4, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more content like this. And as a special discount just for my YouTube students, I have a link down below where you can get this sample pack with the TCI trigger files and all the wave files of all the close mics on the drums and the rooms and all the overheads. This is over 1,100 files. You can get this for less than 20 bucks. And number 4, this is, again, one for the people who don't like to program drums with MIDI and like to drag in wave files instead. So I just opened up my Sourcetrack Samples Noetic pack, dragged in some files real quick, and programmed this. So it sounds fine, but one thing that always bothers me with this, and is super easy to fix, when the drummer is riding on the same cymbal, kind of like right here, where I've got this dark crash, you can hear the stick attack every single time. But when the cymbal is being smashed like that, it's going to be moving. And the drummer's not always going to have that stick attack. It's going to feel more like a wash. Something you can do to combat that is leave the first one alone, but the second and third ones, you can shave off the beginning and just drag this over to the bar line. Same thing with this one. And we'll extend that back over. So we get this. It's a very subtle change, but you're not hearing that stick attack, and over the course of an entire chorus, or even in an entire song, you're not going to hear that stick attack piercing every single time. It's going to sound a lot more realistic and a lot smoother. These are my top 4 ways to get robotic programmed drums to be livened up and sound super realistic. If you think I missed something, let me know in the comments section down below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.